Thank you for having me. I think it's the first time I give a talk with a microphone, so I just have to get used to this. um, so I'm Cecilia. Uh, I just finished my PhD at Cambridge University, and I defended like 1 month ago. So all this work, thank you. So all this work is basically my PhD work, but as of 2 days ago, I started an assistant professorship at Copenhagen Business School, so I'm technically here for that job. So that's why I put both titles here. So my talk today is titled The Social Cognition of Misinformation and Implications for Psychological Interventions. So misinformation is really pervasive on social media, to the extent that it has been named the #1 global threat to society short term in 2024 and remains a top global risk in this year's Global Risks Report as well. And this is, of course, for good reason, because the adverse social, environmental, and political consequences of misinformation really are abundant. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because I think we all agree on it being an important issue. But of course, it has always existed, misinformation. The difference now being the internet and social media and the speed at which it can now spread. For example, in this seminal paper by Vosawi et al., in which they examined the spread of true and false news on Twitter, they concluded that falsehoods diffused significantly further, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in all categories of information. And in addition, due to social media and the digital information environment, our judgments of information now take place within a highly social context where social cues really are ubiquitous. So in today's talk, I'll be presenting some interventions that have been proposed and tested to reduce misinformation susceptibility. But perhaps more importantly, from my perspective, I'll also discuss the importance of considering the social context when developing these interventions. So some potential solutions that have been proposed to misinformation include things like legal and policy interventions and debunking and fact-checking. But one particular problem with these post hoc measures is that it can be really hard to eliminate the influence of misinformation after people have been exposed to it. And this is because misinformation can continue to influence inferential reasoning even after it has been formally retracted, a phenomenon known as the continued influence effect. But also, the presence of misinformation in people's news environments can also undermine accurate information, which is often less persuasive. This means we need to reach people before they are exposed to misinformation, so rather than debunk, we need to pre-bunk. And one very specific form of pre-bunking is getting people a so-called psychological vaccine. This work is rooted in inoculation theory, which was a theory originally proposed by Maguire in the 1960s, which suggests that much like how people can become immunized against a virus, they can also be psychologically vaccinated against persuasive attacks. And the theoretical metaphor is as follows. So with biological vaccines, the patient is exposed to a weak form of a virus, which then triggers the production of antibodies, and then these antibodies can neutralize future invading cells. With psychological vaccines, the so-called patient is exposed to a weak form of an argument, so not a strong argument, but this weak argument can then still trigger the formation of counter-arguments, and these counter-arguments can then be used to potentially neutralize future stronger persuasive attacks. So one of the keys here is that it must be weak, because if we give too strong an argument, they're actually going to be convinced by that false argument. And for it to be considered inoculation and not just pre-bunking, these interventions have to have two components, and the first is a threat component, and the second is a refutational preemption component. So the threat component represents an affective component that is essentially supposed to forewarn participants that a persuasive threat is imminent. And this is meant to then motivate the mind to be ready for attack. And the reputational preemption component represents a cognitive component, which is where participants actually learn how to refute future attacks. And several studies have shown that it's not merely enough to provide the cognitive component, which would be kind of classic pre-bunking, but you need to induce a sense of threat as well in the participant. And these inoculation interventions can be delivered either through text-based interventions or gamified to make them more entertaining. And one of the first and most highly tested interventions developed in the lab that Yar and I have been in the last few years is the bad news game, in which players take on the role of a misinformation producer, and then they learn about the misinformation threat within the game. They're also exposed to these weakened doses of misinformation within the game as they learn to create them themselves, inducing a sense of threat. And then the subsequent opportunity to learn by doing lets them engage in this simulated exercise that cultivate psychological resistance against manipulation techniques. And in our work, we've shown that 15 minutes of gameplay can reduce the perceived reliability of real-world misinformation. And we're not just asking them if it's true or false, we are using a scale in relation to the previous talk. But what about context? So the digital context in which we consume information is full of social cues that may play a role in whether or not we believe something is true. So what is social context? Well, when you see a headline like this, for example, and you're trying to understand whether or not you think it is reliable or not, if we disregard what it actually says in the headline, there are some other cues you might pay attention to. So one is the source, and another is the surrounding social cues. You could also look at the comments and what everyone underneath are saying. Yeah. So in distilling the social context, we can say that there are some social cues around the message, and then there are some source cues you might pay attention to. So digging into the psychology of message sources, we know from decades of research in persuasion that sources play a role in the persuasion process. Specifically, according to dual process theories of persuasion, people can evaluate information and messages via a heuristic or a systematic route, so either via fast or slow processing. And if people are motivated and able, that is, they're in an environment that allows them to, they tend to be persuaded by and pay attention to content. But if we're not motivated and if we're not in environments that allow us to be able to, people tend to instead pay attention to sources and heuristic cues. So if we think about social media and the way in which people consume information, this might not be the case. So social media sites expose people to an excessive influx of information, and news consumers feel overloaded with the amount of information they are confronted with. And as individual attention is limited, social media users may not actively be evaluating the content that they are confronted with. So the question I ask then is, do they instead rely on sources? So let's look at the role of sources. So from the persuasion literature, we know that when an individual is exposed to a message, in order to evaluate the reliability of that message, they look to the source and they make an assessment about what they think of that source. And of course, these judgments will vary between people. And specifically, what people tend to evaluate is the perceived credibility of that source. And a factor that has consistently been shown to impact whether people think a source is credible or not is the perceived similarity between the source and the message receiver. And this can be on multiple characteristics, from something as simple as appearance to background, or something more deeper like values, and in particular, political similarity, so whether they share the same political identity as that source. So building on this literature and applying it to misinformation, I was interested in understanding whether we're more likely to believe the same misinformation if it comes from a political in-group source, and also why this might be. So in 3 studies, I tried to answer this question. So in 2 of the studies, I exposed people to news headlines where I manipulated whether it came from a traditionally conservative or liberal source, and we used multiple different sources. And in one of the studies, we simply gave participants a description of the source to avoid any prior experience with those sources. And we kept the misinformation the same. We also looked at factual information, but here I'll just present the results on misinformation. And we then asked them to assess the reliability of these headlines to try to see whether source would matter. And this is just an example of what a headline in each condition could look like in the 2 first studies, where we just manipulated the source, and we also had a control condition in one of the studies. So the question is, are we more likely to believe the same fake information if it comes from our in-group source? So here are the results from the first study. So here we used real US news outlets, but there was a slight issue with the online sample, in the sense that it was an online convenience sample and we could not limit it to US participants. So this means that some might not have experience with sources like CNN and Fox News. So we did expect our results to be a bit reduced if we were to find something. But here we have the perceived reliability on the y-axis of these false headlines. And this is if it came in the control condition with no source. And there was no difference if it came from a dissimilar or outgroup source. But when it came from a politically similar source, that is, we categorize whether the source is similar to them or not, participants were more likely to believe the headlines. And this effect size is quite modest, and we thought it's likely due to having the discrepancy between, or the convenience sample not being limited to US. So we ran a similar study, but limited it this time to US participants. And we here see the same effects, and we could also break it down by ideology. So the blue color indicates if the misinformation came from a conservative source, and the orange is if it came from a liberal source. So you can see that there is like a symmetry on both sides, so that liberals perceive misinformation from liberal sources as more reliable, and conservatives too. And equally, they discriminate against misinformation from the opposing sources. And we also see, when we ask them about the credibility of the sources, that each side thinks that the other side's sources are not credible. And interestingly, we see that liberals actually kind of discriminate more by source than conservatives, and there are several explanations for this, which I don't have time to get into, but happy to talk about later. And we also ran this mediation analysis, where we find that it's in fact perceived credibility that mediates the effect of political similarity on misinformation susceptibility. So for example, here you can see down here that the more conservative someone was, the less they perceive liberal sources to be credible, and then in turn, the less accurate they perceive misinformation to be from those sources. And we see the same opposite for misinformation from conservative sources, so that the more conservative someone was, the more credible they found misinformation from conservative sources via its perceived credibility. And in study 3, this was where we just gave them descriptions of sources. We replicate this effect, so it doesn't really matter if you've seen the source before. If you've never seen it and you just hear that it is left-wing or right-wing, we see the same effect, that if it's similar, you're more likely to believe misinformation and dissimilar less likely. So the answer to the first question is that yes, we are more likely to believe the same fake information if it comes from a political in-group source, and this is likely influenced by our perceptions of those sources' credibility. Now, turning again to this framework, we've now seen that source cues do contribute to people's judgments of misinformation, and I wanted next to look at social cues. From a social psychological perspective, there is substantial evidence that shows that our beliefs and judgments are shaped socially and not in isolation. For example, research like Ash's conformity experiment or Cialdini's work on social influence illustrates how we are impacted by perceived consensus within groups. That is what we think other people believe. So this research is really relevant to look at when we look at our digital and highly social media environments. So in looking at social cues in my work, I broke these down into two different types. So either looking at explicit cues, so this could be actual direct information about what other people believe and what other people think. But sometimes we also might be exposed to more implicit forms of social cues where people aren't directly saying you don't have direct access to what a group thinks, but you can see their comments and what their comments potentially imply about the information. So my question was whether we're more likely to believe the same fake information if we think that other people believe it. So in a study with 730 participants recruited on Prolific, we had 5 different conditions in which people saw misinformation. So they either were exposed to a form of explicit endorsement, so judgments of other people, endorsing the misinformation, saying that X amount found it to be true, or an explicit form of just discrediting, so the group thinks that this is false, or an implicit form of endorsement where they simply see comments that suggest that people think it's unreliable, think that it is reliable, versus discrediting, where they see comments where those people think that it is unreliable, or a control where they just see the headline. And then their task is to judge the reliability of the headlines. So just to give an example of what this could look like, in the explicit condition, before seeing each headline, they were exposed to a statement like this saying 76% of previous participants in the study judged the following headline to be reliable. And then in the discrediting condition, it would say unreliable. And in the implicit conditions, we showed people social media comments underneath the headlines. And in this condition, it is actually the endorsement condition. So we thought it would be inauthentic to have comments say, this is reliable, because people don't say that on social media. So instead, we came up with different ways of implying that people think that these headlines are reliable. So for example, this headline says, warning, smartphone causes explosion, leaving elderly pensioner to fight for her life. If you own one, return it immediately, your safety is at risk. And comments are saying things like, and yet you can bring phones and lighters on a plane. Like, it's implying that they think this headline is reliable. And in the control condition, they just see the headlines. So what is the difference here? So with the explicit cues where they're exposed to direct judgments of others, they were more likely to perceive misinformation as reliable if a previous majority had judged it to be reliable. And interestingly, there was no difference between the control and discrediting. So if they had seen comments kind of implying that, if they had been exposed to participant judgments where other participants thought it was unreliable, it didn't affect their judgment, likely because they were already able to see that it was not true, unless when they were exposed to other people saying that it was true, it led them to question their potentially initial judgment. And we see the same effect, but smaller for the implicit cues, which was the comments. So participants were more likely to perceive misinformation as reliable if the comments underneath were endorsing its validity compared to not. And again, we saw no difference between the control and the discrediting conditions. So this signals that calling out misinformation online might not even matter, but that when people signal they believe it, this is what pushes others over the edge. So here we have then found that misinformation really isn't evaluated in isolation. We pay attention to contextual cues when we evaluate whether something is true or false. So in line with the biological metaphor, we can say that we have identified two strains of misinformation that are particularly persuasive, and one is misinformation when it originates from an in-group source, and also misinformation that is endorsed by a majority. So another question I asked then in my PhD was, given this, do misinformation interventions then even work when people are simultaneously exposed to these persuasive social cues that exist in the digital environment? So in the first study, I asked whether we can then inoculate participants against misinformation from political in-group sources. And in a kind of classic inoculation experiment, the participant will engage in a pre-survey where they're asked questions about false headlines. They then will engage in the intervention, which in this case was the bad news game. They will play the bad news game. And then in the post-survey, they will be asked questions about misinformation again, and we can see whether or not they improve after gameplay. And in the study that I ran, I added two conditions on either side so that in the beginning, participants were exposed either to just the misinformation or misinformation from a left-leaning source or a right-leaning source, or several left or right-leaning sources, and we then recoded these to be in-groups and out-groups. They all play the bad news game, and we can then see whether there is a different effect of the treatment depending on the source of the misinformation. And then here is what we found. So these are the results. So the blue bars you'll see represent the perceived reliability of misinformation before they are inoculated, and the yellow will be after they are inoculated. So in the control condition, we can see that there is a significant improvement after gameplay, as we would expect. They judge misinformation as being less reliable after gameplay. And we also see the same when it came from an outgroup source, so they are improving there. And most importantly, they are also improving in the in-group misinformation conditions. So even when the misinformation came from a political in-group, they were substantially better at seeing that it was unreliable after gameplay. And what's particularly important is actually that before gameplay, there was a significant difference between the in-group and out-group misinformation. They judged it as more reliable if it came from an in-group, but this difference was actually statistically gone on the post-test, indicating that potentially we have reduced the gap between the source effects. However, we would need to verify this in another experiment. And the second question then is, can we also then inoculate participants against misinformation that is endorsed by a majority? So given that we in the previous study saw that these explicit cues were the most influential and persuasive on people, we decided to use these in an inoculation study. So this study was designed to test if we could reduce susceptibility to misinformation via inoculation, even if that misinformation is presented alongside social cues that indicate that others believe it. So here we had two factors. So this was not a pre-post test, but instead a two-factorial design. So participants were either inoculated via a text-based inoculation intervention, or they engaged in a control word search task. And they also either saw social proof alongside the headlines, or they saw only the headlines. So this allowed us to compare differences on multiple levels. And the inoculation message, this time it was a text-based message in which we forewarned them here in the first threat component about the threat of misinformation. And we here have the cognitive component where we provide them with tools to spot emotional manipulation in headlines. So we focused on the emotion fallacy here. And here are the results. So here, instead, what we have on the y-axis is accuracy discernment. So it's how good people are at distinguishing between true and false. So here, higher scores are better than lower scores. So in the control condition, where people are not inoculated, we can see that if they see misinformation with no social cues, they are better at distinguishing between true and false. If they see it with social cues, they are worse at distinguishing between true and false. And we see the same effect actually in the inoculation condition. So even inoculated participants had an effect of social cues. So if they saw social cues, they were worse at distinguishing between what was true and false than if they didn't see social cues, even though they had been inoculated. So there is an effect of social cues for even inoculated participants. Another interesting finding from this study, which was just a bit of a personal interest in the lab, was figuring out how people think about whether or not they themselves are likely to be influenced by others. Because we had a hunch that from anecdotal evidence, everyone thinks that they are immune to influence, and it is their grandma and their weird high school friend and everyone else that's susceptible to influence and not themselves. So we asked them two questions. We asked, how likely are you to be influenced by social cues, and how likely are others? And there is a clear difference. So people tend to think that it is everyone else who is influenced by the group, and they themselves are immune. And when we ask them about misinformation, we see the same effect. So, are you influenced by misinformation? No. Is your social circle? Yes. Which I think is an important finding in relation to future interventions. So we can see here that inoculation does offer some protective effects against social influence, but inoculated individuals can still, in some instances, be impacted by social cues, which, in my opinion, means that we need to develop interventions that actually target these social influence effects more directly. So thank you very much for listening, and that was all I had. Yeah, I think we mean the same as truthfulness, but so we have tried different kind of versions of how to ask, whether we have asked about the perceived reliability, or we just asked them about reliability on a scale from 1 to 7. We don't give them any description of what reliable means, so we kind of rely on their own judgment of that. But when we have asked them about, when we have kind of rephrased it to be, how likely is X to be true? For example, how likely is it to be true that, and then you insert kind of what the headline says. Or if we ask them how accurate is the content, there's no difference in results. So it seems that people are kind of interpreting the question the same way. Yeah. Actually, that is something I am working on right now. So I had a little video to show, and it has sound, but all the sound is like nice music. So I'm just gonna play it in the background here. So basically, something that I've been working on is figuring out how we can design games and interventions. So specifically, games that don't just target people who want to learn about misinformation, because that's what these misinformation games tend to do, is they reach only those who want to learn about misinformation in the first place. Um, and instead developing interventions that are designed as games for entertainment, but that subtly educate about misinformation without being framed as education interventions. So for example, a game that I've been working with some game designers on is called Solomon's Secret, which is a murder mystery detective game in which you learn about social influence, and you learn in subtle ways about how other people can influence your perceptions of information and how groups can sway you, but completely removing it from the misinformation space. We're not even talking about what might be true and false in a political, environmental, or health space, but we're kind of teaching people in subtle ways that their judgments of information within a mystery game could be influenced by the group and by their assessments of sources, and how a source's credibility can change over time and depend on your relation with that source. So I think we need to move beyond just a 7-minute game that people play in a one-off time, and that again, yeah, only reaches those who are already interested in learning about misinformation, which are often the least likely to fall for it in the first place. Oh yes, so I mean, for the headlines that we used, we didn't have any images in the studies that I ran, but I think the headlines, I wouldn't the videos, they would, in my opinion, not be necessarily like a social cue in how I define social cues, but I think they're definitely an influential cue, and I think images play a really, really powerful role, and I think that that's something that's so much more complicated to get into as a psychologist who wants to have like clear, controlled experiments, but something that's necessary if we want to understand the misinformation space more broadly, because images are becoming are a lot more persuasive than text often, and are a lot more easily manipulated now. And they used to be kind of the ground truth, right? But not anymore. I would also say they are also like a credibility cue, because if people think that a video is authentic, it adds to kind of the credibility of a message. And yeah, I mean, they can be both faked nowadays, but they can also be misplaced. So put into the wrong context, an image can really change, or can really be misinformation, even if the image is completely real, right? Yeah, 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 exactly. So the question is, are the people who are most susceptible to social cues also most most? I mean, without having the data on it, I think that they are not necessarily the same people. I think that uh, people who respond more to social pressures are because they can be they can have two parts, right? It can be either informational or normative. So you can either respond to social cues because you want to fit in, or because you think that the group is actually correct. So I think depending on the underlying reason why you follow the group, it's going to maybe interact with whether someone is responsive to inoculation. Um, I would say that someone who is more influenced by social cues is probably going to have less lasting impact of inoculation once they go out into the real world and are then exposed to social cues again, even if they kind of wanted to conform to the experiment, within the experiment, and show that they have learned something. But I think what was interesting about this study is that it was the first time I conducted one that was not a pre-post test. So we are not like comparing people's ability before and after. Those who were inoculated have never not been inoculated in a way. So they cannot like change their judgment to like fit with what we want. Um, yeah, I think so. I think the decay would be selective. Yeah. Yeah, especially in the real world, and that's again, even when we test the decay of interventions, these decay studies are also conducted outside the social world. So once you put social cues in there again, you might see different decay effects as well. Yeah. I think this is like a really tough question, because I think that they can actually be super useful, but I think that they can also be dangerous if not moderated. So I would almost say they would have to be moderated community notes. Yeah, just because from the research that I've seen, crowds can be super wise, but biased crowds are not. And depending on the community that you are in, and whether you are on Twitter or on Facebook or which like media environment you're in, those community notes could also really be harmful if it's kind of a very biased community and unmoderated. Um, yeah, so I have a kind of, yeah. Yeah. Thank you.